Reads is a gathering, really, of people from the community where we celebrate literature and we read the same book all together to give us something to talk to our neighbor about, to stop the person on the subway, to really foster conversation within our town. And because of this, I'm really excited to introduce this evening's author. I think we're very fortunate this year to have Celeste with us. As you all know, and the reason you're here tonight is Everything I Never Told You was our selection this year, and I thought it was a wonderful book. And if you've had a chance to attend any of the conversations that have surrounded this year's event, I think you would agree that it's given us a lot to think about and discuss as a community. I want to thank our committee members before we start. This event is sponsored by the trustees of the Brookline Public Library and hosted by the Programming Committee. I'm Magdalene Moran, the chair of that committee. I need to thank my fellow committee members who have done a tremendous amount of work to make this happen tonight. Karen Livingston, Ann Reed, who's our staff member, Regina Healy, Karen Troy and Lowy, and Hank Philippi Ryan. So I want to thank them all. I also want to thank Dana, who's here from our local independent bookseller. We're very proud to still have one. Dana is here to sell books tonight, and Celeste has graciously agreed to autograph books after tonight's event. So please help support this event and the Booksmith here. So thank you, Dana, for participating with so many events hosted by the library. So without further ado, I know you're all here to hear Celeste. As you know, this book has garnered a tremendous amount of attention. It was named the Amazon Book of the Year in 2014. It was one of the top 100 books from the New York Times. And I think it's really engendered a range of emotions in people who've read it. So without further ado, help me welcome Celeste and thank her for coming tonight.
All right, I was told that I need to talk really close. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I don't usually do the handheld mic thing, and I feel like I should be saying something. But thank you, Magdalene, so much for that introduction. Thank you so much to the Brookline Library for choosing the book as the Brookline Read selection and for inviting me here. And thanks to all of you for coming this evening. I'm truly honored to be here. I've been very fortunate to get to speak about Everything I Never Told You quite a bit over the past year. And I've begun to notice a pattern, which is certain questions always seem to come up from readers. What kind of research did I do? Was any of this inspired by real events? Are there parts that are autobiographical? And those are all facets of, I think, the biggest question that you can ask about a book, which is the differences and the overlaps between fact and fiction. And I myself am fascinated by this divide, both as a writer and as a reader. So this evening, I'd like to talk a little about the relationship between fact and fiction and how the two have influenced each other in Everything I Never Told You. And if at a certain point I start moving this away and you can't hear me, just start waving from the back. So there's a common perception that all fiction is secretly autobiography. And there are a lot of good reasons for this, one of which is that a lot of it is actually secretly autobiography. But even when we've made up a plot, when we writers go looking for extras and props and moments, we go into our mental attics, and what we find there are the things that we've experienced. So your fifth grade orchestra teacher with her coppery Dorothy Hamill haircut, and the way she would hit you with her bow if you made a mistake. Or the brown wool hat that your father wore with a little pom-pom on top for 30 years every winter while he shoveled snow. Or the way that your mother, let's say, inexplicably pronounces Chicago with a hard CH, like chocolate. All of the images and emotions that you've been accumulating for your entire life are there for the pilfering. And so as a writer, your job is to go up there and to pilfer. But there's a larger reason that we're really interested in this question of fact and fiction too. When a book has made you feel something, as the best fiction hopefully does. When a book has opened you up to some kind of emotional truth, it's hard to believe that there isn't a literal truth there as well, that these events didn't happen in, quote unquote, real life, exactly as they did in fiction. So this is the fundamental mystery, I think, of fiction, and also the fundamental magic of it, that made-up stories about made-up people can tell you real truths. Because even when there are elements of truth in a story, it's still made up. And I think this is why we keep coming back to these questions of fact versus fiction. We want to know, where has real life seeped into this novel? And what can this piece of fiction, this made-up story about made-up people, tell me about real life? In my writing, I've found that there are moments when life gives me something so puzzling that I can't get it out of my head. I keep thinking about it and trying to make some kind of sense out of it. And the way that I make sense out of those moments is by making a story from that real life seed. So here's an example. When I was growing up, my mother had a Betty Crocker cookbook. This is where it gets tricky to hold the microphone and show you my mom's cookbook. So my mother got this cookbook in the 60s, soon after she moved to the United States. And this is the cookbook that we had in my house growing up. This is the cookbook that I learned to cook from. So I have a lot of fond feelings for this Betty Crocker cookbook, and here's Betty herself on the back. It wasn't until I was an adult and my mother was downsizing to a condo that I looked at this cookbook again as an adult. So I went to her house, which was my childhood home, and helped her pack up stuff. And I happened to pick this cookbook up. And for the first time, I read the text that was actually around the recipes. So I'm going to read you a couple. And if you've read the novel, some of these may sound familiar. So this is from the pie section, and this is the introduction. It says, "If you care about pleasing a man, bake a pie, but make sure it's a perfect pie." Right. This is from the introduction to the egg chapter under basic eggs. It says, "The man you marry will know the way he likes his eggs, and chances are he'll be fussy about them. So it behooves a good wife to know how to make an egg behave in 6 basic ways." And here they are with helpful hints. So one more. This is from the preserves, relishes, and garnishes chapter. And this is what it says to get you, the cook, really excited about making your own preserves, relishes, and garnishes. So it says, "Betty's pickles, Aunt Alice's peach conserve, Mary's mint relish." I hope you can hear the exclamation points there. "Is there anything nicer than a gift you made yourself? Anything that gives you a deeper sense of satisfaction than a row of shining jars and glasses standing on your shelf?" So the whole cookbook is like that. It's just got this delightful kind of cheery, casual sexism running through it. And I was simultaneously fascinated and horrified by this cookbook. And I started to imagine, what might it be like to be a woman in this era when everything in your world, right down to your cookbook, was telling you what was supposed to satisfy you, especially if maybe you had other ideas. The idea of a mother began to emerge in my mind as a character. A mother who was confronted by a cookbook telling her what she was supposed to want, but who found that she actually wanted more. But I didn't want to write a story just about this cookbook or just about my mother. I had the sense that I had found the edge of something larger, that there was something bigger at stake here than one woman or one particular cookbook. I wanted to step beyond what I knew, my mother's own career, the cookbook that I had known since I was a child and look at the bigger picture. I wanted to find something that applied not just to me and not just to my mother, but to a wider world of women. So I began to read about women at universities in the 1950s and the 1960s. I began to hear about the challenges that they faced and the reaction of others, both men and women, to their chosen careers. One account in Harvard Magazine gives you a good sense of what the era was like for so many women. It was written by a woman named Anne Shapiro, who entered Radcliffe in 1954, and a few years ago, she wrote this piece as she looked back on her time there. So this is what she says. On going to college, she wrote, "My mother had advised me to study home economics at Brookline College like my cousin, Bernice. What will you be?" she asked. "You'll change diapers just as well without all that education." I was furious, not so much because Mother was wrong, but because she might just have been right. About life after graduation, she notes, "The only published information about our options appeared in the Radcliffe yearbook, which identified the possibilities as washing diapers, typing an employer's dull letters, or tackling graduate work." And indeed, Shapiro soon found herself feeling trapped in the sphere of domesticity. "I spent more time reading The Cat in the Hat than pondering the symbolism of Melville's white whale," she writes. "My husband assured me that I could work if I wished, as long as it didn't interfere with his life. I was to understand that my real job was wife and mother. By the time my third child was born, I had become the woman Betty Friedan wrote about in The Feminine Mystique, vaguely longing for something beyond the confines of my pink kitchen." This kind of account was all too common for women at this time, and I took some of the frustration that I heard in their voices, and the divide that many felt from both their mothers, who maybe didn't understand the desire for a career, and their daughters, who would have career opportunities that they never would. And I used that frustration to develop the character of Marilyn, the mother in my novel. On the surface, Marilyn is not very much like my mother at all. My own mother was born in Hong Kong, and in real life she did go into science. She became a chemist and taught at the university level for many years. In the novel, Marilyn is a white woman from Virginia, and she's what they would have called at the time a housewife. She doesn't work outside the house. But she had other ambitions. She wanted to be a doctor, and it doesn't turn out that way for her. But at one point in the novel, Marilyn finds her mother's cookbook, which is also my real mother's real cookbook, and it prompts her to reconsider her life and make some pretty drastic decisions. You can already see that fact and fiction intersect with each other a little bit like sound waves, amplifying. Here's another example. The novel takes place in the 1960s and 70s, which is the heart of the space race. As a child, I had wanted to become an astronaut. That seemed like a realistic ambition at the time. I come from a whole family of scientists, and I'm still kind of a huge science nerd. So I decided to give one of the children in the novel, Nath, my obsession with space as a little bit of writerly wish fulfillment. I grew up in the shuttle era, so I had to research the earlier missions, Apollo, which went to the moon, and Gemini, which led up to Apollo. What I learned was that when Gemini 9 launched in 1966, there was extensive media coverage. CBS devoted literally hours broadcasting the launch and the mission over 4 days. So because this is 2015, I watched the entire broadcast of the mission on YouTube. You can go online and you can watch the original newscasts. As I watched, I gathered lots of fascinating details. The countdown clock, which was superimposed in yellow over the screen in what must have been cutting-edge technology at the time. Walter Cronkite's desk, which they had set up outside near the launch pad, and the wind that was kind of disarraying his hair as he tried to be very serious. But I also got a sense of the mood of the era, and what people watching that broadcast might have felt. At the time, no one had yet landed on the moon, and space travel was still incredibly dangerous. In fact, the original crew for this mission had died in a crash just a few months before the launch. And space was incredibly new, I realized at that time. mission involved a spacewalk, where the astronauts go outside the vehicle and walk around. But it wasn't yet possible to broadcast video footage from space. So the station hired an actor on a movie set, in an astronaut suit, on wires, so he looked like he was floating, acting out what the astronauts were doing in space as the live audio feed came in, for more than an hour. So imagine such a thing happening on TV now. No network would ever air this, and if they did, we would all change the channel. But in 1966, watching this video of this actor on a soundstage, I kind of realized space travel still had an allure then that we've sort of forgotten now. It was still so fascinating that a major network would air a simulation live with actors on wires in the middle of the day, and people would watch it. So in the novel, Nath watches these broadcasts as they happen, and I tried to convey both the details of what he saw and the feeling of amazement and terror and wonder that people watching that same launch must have felt in an era not yet jaded by space travel. Thematically, I realized that desire to explore new worlds and the fear about what might happen in that exploration spoke to a larger theme, the desire that we often have as young people to leave the safe orbit of our families. In the novel, Nath, the older brother, can't wait to leave his family behind. His sister Lydia, meanwhile, is terrified of what might happen when she does. And those two reactions, longing for independence and also fearing it, turned out to be central to the novel. And that all came from researching space exploration and from my own childhood dream of becoming an astronaut. Again, fact and fiction, they intersect with each other in weird ways. There was one aspect of the novel that I actually didn't need to research very much. At one of the very first interviews that I did, someone asked me, "How did you research the racism?" And I loved the idea that maybe in some library there was a book for this, like a concise dictionary of slurs, or like the big book of racism that I could open up and learn all about it. But sadly, this was a place where I actually didn't have to do a lot of research. With one exception, every one of the incidents of racial tension in the novel is something that's happened to me or to somebody that I know personally. From kids chanting mocking songs on the playground, to strangers pulling their eyes into slits in the grocery store, to people complimenting me on how good my English is, which I would certainly hope so, as it's the only language that I speak. I didn't have to look very far to find examples of ways that racism can manifest itself toward Asian Americans. Although I generally felt at home and accepted growing up, I was still not immune to hearing racial slurs, to being called names, or to encountering what we might now call microaggressions, comments or gestures that are maybe not intended maliciously, but that serve to remind you of your otherness. Where are you from? No, but where are you really from? Comments like these force you to continually be aware that you're different from those around you. I've yet to meet an Asian American, or actually any person of color, who hasn't experienced something similar. And I wanted readers to have that pervasive feeling of being not only out of place, but conspicuous, to think about what it might feel like to be constantly other. Because that feeling of being different has been such a formative factor in my own life, I wanted to explore what it might feel like to feel other, even within your own family. What might it be like to feel those tensions and microaggressions from your own parents or your own spouse? As the family in my novel came into focus, I realized that they were a biracial family. And because this was a novel focusing on an interracial marriage, I read a lot about the history of interracial marriage. I was surprised to learn that until 1967, some states still prohibited marriage between the races. That seems very late to me. I studied Loving v. Virginia, which is the Supreme Court case that finally made interracial marriage legal across the United States. And I was shocked to find that the first year a majority of Americans approved of interracial marriage was 1997. In my novel, Marilyn and James, the parents, would have married at almost the exact same time as Mildred and Richard Loving, the couple in the Supreme Court case. So I read about the Lovings, and as many first-hand accounts and newspaper reports of interracial marriage as I could find. I wanted to see how other people, especially their families, might have reacted to such a marriage. And all those real-life experiences fed into the fictional family in Everything I Never Told You. I think about this issue of otherness a lot, not only because it speaks to my experience, but because it speaks to the next generations as well. I'm actually in an interracial marriage myself, and I have a young biracial son. So I wonder and I worry about what his experience will be like, and what I can do to make him feel accepted and at home, rather than other. And this leads me to the last thing that I want to talk about. Just as real life seeps its way into fiction, fiction can have an effect on real life too. Because if you're lucky, and I've been very lucky in this respect, books go out into the world and get read by real people. One thing that's happened since my novel has been published is that I've been hailed as a bright new Asian American writer. And for a long time, this was a term that I had really resisted. The phrase felt very loaded, Asian American writer. I wanted to be known not as an Asian American writer, and not as a Chinese American writer, but as a writer, full stop. In part, this is because of what I've jokingly called the Amy Tan effect. If you ask anyone to name an Asian writer, odds are pretty good that Amy Tan will be the first name they come up with. Since the publication of her best-selling novel, The Joy Luck Club, in 1989, Amy Tan has become probably the best-known Asian American writer in contemporary literature. And there's very good reason for that. She's published a half a dozen novels, most of them bestsellers, and all of them critically acclaimed. The Joy Luck Club was made into a film, and she's even guest starred on The Simpsons, which for my money is the true marker of fame. But here's the problem. Chinese American writers mostly get compared to other Chinese American writers, and often they get compared to Amy Tan. Maybe they get compared to other East Asian writers, but that's often as far as it goes. So here are some examples. Of Lan Samantha Chang, who's a Chinese American writer, of Lan Samantha Chang's novel Inheritance, Library Journal wrote, "Readers who enjoy the works of strong women writers like Amy Tan, Gail Tsukiyama, and Hong Ying will relish this." It's no coincidence that those strong women writers are also women of Asian American descent, of Asian descent. Of Chang's collection Hunger, the Washington Post said it invited comparisons to Amy Tan and Maxine Hong Kingston. Reviewing Gus Lee's novel China Boy, School Library Journal noted, "This timeless, magically told tale of growing up and coming of age is a perfect companion to Tan's Joy Luck Club or Kingston's Woman Warrior, but not, apparently, to any other tales of growing up or coming of age." Kirkus Reviews described David Wong Louis' collection Pangs of Love as a worthy, if more prosaic, companion to recent similar chronicles by Amy Tan, Maxine Hong Kingston, and others. And in reviewing Wong's debut novel, The Barbarians Are Coming, Newsday called Wong funny as Gish Jen and eloquent as Chang Wei Li. Somewhere in the commandments of reviewing must be written, "Thou shalt not compare Asians to non-Asians." A similar fate actually befalls writers of other minorities too. Check any bookshelf of contemporary fiction and you'll see what I mean. Black writers get compared to black writers, Jewish writers get compared to Jewish writers, gay writers get compared to gay writers. When my friend Preeta Samarasinghe, a woman of Indian descent, published her novel, Evening is the Whole Day, the publisher's description boasted that it was sure to earn her a place alongside Arundhati Roy, Kiran Desai, and Zadie Smith. She and I joked that her place was on the shelf of brown women writers. As a fellow Indian woman, Samarasinghe can apparently hope to become a Bharati Mukherjee or a Jhumpa Lahiri, but not a Toni Morrison or an A.S. Byatt, or an Amy Tan for that matter. So what's wrong with comparing writers of similar cultural background? First, it suggests that all writers of similar background are telling the same story, which is a disappointingly reductive view. And worse, by extension, it implies that if you've heard one story, you've heard them all. Amy Tan herself sums up the problem neatly in her memoir, The Opposite of Fate. She quotes a New York Times review of her novel, The Kitchen God's Wife, that compares her to fellow Chinese-American writers Maxine Hong Kingston, Betty Bao Lord, and Nian Chang. Then she observes, the underlying message to the reader, these books are similar, but one book is better than the other. Pick only one. Some reviewers tend to reduce the books to the most obvious and general abstractions, the themes of immigration and assimilation. They overlook the specifics of narrative detail, language, and imagery that make the story and the characters unlike any that have been written before. I once sat on a panel with an Afghani writer whose novel had initially been turned down by several publishers. Their reasoning? We don't need another Afghan novel. We already have Khaled Hosseini. That was not the first or the last time that I had heard such a story. There's another problem too. Consistently putting Asian American writers, or writers of any particular culture, into their own pigeonhole sets up some pretty weighty expectations. It suggests that you're writing to educate the reader about your culture, and as such that you will be writing mostly about Asian things. The reaction to Asian writers who choose to write about non-Asian things may be hesitation or outright skepticism. For example, when Chinese-American writer Bill Chang published his debut novel, Southern Cross the Dog, in 2013, numerous critics wondered why he, born and raised in Queens, would write a novel about 1927 Mississippi. The New York Times covered the book twice, once in a piece called Seeing Mississippi, Sight Unseen, and once in a piece called Imagining a Past That Isn't His Own. Both pieces questioned whether an Asian American man could truly imagine the Deep South. While these expectations happen to some degree in other contexts, the problem is particularly pronounced for writers of color. We're less likely, for example, to question why Arthur Golden, Tennessee born and bred in 1956, would choose to write Memoirs of a Geisha, which takes place in Japan around World War II. Similarly, when we encounter a novel like Anthony Doerr's All the Light We Cannot See, we don't tend to say he speaks for white Europeans, who are the only characters in the book, or for Doerr's own racial group, white European Americans. We say things, as one review did, we say things like, they are powerful examples of the way average people in trying times must decide daily between morality and survival. The overall problem that I'm getting at here is the question of representation. When your writing comes attached to an Asian name or to an Asian face, people tend to assume that you will write about your own culture, quotation mark very much intended. And they tend to assume that the story you tell will somehow be representative of that culture, that you, by an act of synecdoche, will speak for everyone. So because of all this, I view the term Asian American writer with quite a bit of trepidation. The general sense that Asian American writers are supposed to write about Asian things concern me, especially because some of my work doesn't involve Asian characters. Growing up without much of an Asian community, I never felt like an expert on the culture, and I certainly wasn't very comfortable writing about it. The imagery that comes much more readily to me is that of suburban America. I'm much more likely to write about peeling the yellow wax paper off of a hamburger at Wendy's than I am to write about Chinese kitchen gods. When I did tackle Chinese culture in my work, it was always at a distance. A white woman who grieves her husband using Chinese mourning rituals. An adopted Chinese girl who tries to find her way into Chinese culture in college. I certainly didn't feel qualified to write about Chinese culture as an insider, and nor really did I want to. Asian American writer, for a long time, felt like a label that had been slapped on from the outside, and one that I wasn't sure was entirely accurate. And yet, as my novel, Everything I Never Told You, has made its way into the world, I found myself beginning to embrace that label of Asian American writer. Because the problem is that all too often, writers of color just go unnoticed. Last fall, I was asked to speak at a university. The event organizer admitted that he had invited me because he needed an Asian woman writer to round out his lineup. And I actually had no problem with that. Selecting writers with an eye to diversity is often necessary in order to expose readers to writers of different backgrounds. But I was startled by what he said next, which was, you know, there aren't very many of you out there. And I thought, were there not really that many of us out there? I put out a call on Twitter because I'm a Twitter junkie, and I was soon flooded with names of Asian American women writers. I narrowed my list to fiction writers, then I narrowed it to fiction writers who published at least one book, which is usually who universities want to speak. And the list still numbered into the hundreds. And yet the perception, one that I'd heard not just from this event organizer, but from other organizers as well, was that they hadn't noticed us. They just hadn't seen us. And that idea of being seen is a very powerful one. When Everything I Never Told You came out, I began to get emails from readers, real people who, to my astonishment, had actually read my book. And I was struck by how many of them saw themselves in the characters. So here are some excerpts from the notes I've received. Your novel struck a chord and resonated so deeply within me in ways I didn't know writing could. I am an 18-year-old Japanese-American girl. My Japanese father was born in America. I felt at so many points as if you had been in my house in my childhood, had recorded with a tape recorder the exact words of my parents. I am mixed race. My dad is from Peru and is mostly Chinese, and my mom is white. Reading your book echoed some of my experience. I want to say thank you for your book. It is so hard to find books that I can see myself in as a person of mixed race. I wish I had been exposed to your book in high school, a time in my life when I needed to see my race as protagonists. I can't tell you how refreshing it was to read about characters that reflected me physically. You probably get a lot of praise for creating diverse characters, but to me they are not that different from my reality. I see these characters every day. I am these characters. These are actually the most humbling letters that I have ever gotten. When my novel first came out and I started to get reviews, I was utterly terrified. And I said to my husband, the book is out there in the real world and people are reading it. And he very gently reminded me that that is actually the idea of novelty. But now, a year plus after the novel has been published, I can tell you that getting responses like these from readers has been, hands down, the most rewarding part of the experience. The theme here again is being seen, something that I think a lot about in my life and in my work. Everyone in my novel is overlooked for various reasons, and everyone longs to be seen properly. The mother, Marilyn, is frustrated that she's seen only as a wife and mother, and that her own ambitions are overlooked. James, her husband, is frustrated that he'll always be seen first and foremost as an Asian man, and as a foreigner. Lydia, the troubled middle daughter, longs to be seen as her own person, rather than the blank screen upon which her parents project their expectations. And her siblings, Nate and Hannah, long to be seen at all as they grow up in their favored sister's shadow. So it meant a tremendous amount to me to learn that readers felt seen by this book. Women, writers of color, and Asians all tend to be overlooked for many reasons, but it's important that we and our work be seen. As I've taken on more of a public presence, it's become more and more important to me to be visible, to sort of stand up and be counted, both as a writer of color generally and as an Asian American writer in particular. Being seen, being recognized, being acknowledged is a fundamental human desire. Spend a little bit of time with a toddler and you'll see it's ingrained from the very, very start. the toddler always wants your acknowledgement. Being seen says you exist. You have a self. Being seen is affirming, and being seen is empowering. And this is the place I realized where fiction and real life intersect most powerfully. Because being seen, fundamentally, is what fiction is actually about. I've been speaking of being seen as something that happens from the outside in, the way that you sitting out there can see me standing here. But being seen, at least in fiction, happens from the inside out as well. Fiction has the unique capacity to place you inside someone's skin, to have you recognize them as a person, and to see things, quite literally, from inside their head. The novelist Ian McEwan has written of storytelling and the empathy that it demands, imagining what it is like to be someone other than yourself is at the core of our humanity. It is the essence of compassion, and it is the beginning of morality. What better way to truly see someone than to view the world through their eyes, to think their thoughts and to feel their emotions as the best fiction asks you to do? Once that has happened, you realize that whatever the writer or character's culture or race or background, there is a kinship between you. And the more diversely you read, the more your humanity grows. That, perhaps, is the most powerful thing that can happen when fiction and real life intersect. And this, in large part, is why I'm now proud to identify as an Asian American writer. I hope that my work holds up a mirror to some small part of my readers' lives, whatever their background. That it provides a way, however small, for people to see themselves and to help them be seen more clearly, both in fiction and in real life. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions now as well about the book or heckling or yes.
I just wanted to share that I'm in a book group of moms of kids who are 15, 16, and we've all known each other since our kids were sat in this auditorium when they were little. And we picked. Oh yeah, I'm in a book group of moms from Brookline whose kids are now 15, 16, and we picked this book not knowing that Brookline, that it was a town reads book. We picked it in the summer because somebody had heard it was wonderful, and I just want to say that our discussion the evening after we read that was one of the most heated, intense discussions we've ever had, and very little of it had to do with biculturalism. Most of it had to do with empathy for moms of that era, what we actually go through as moms of this era, somehow feeling an alliance with moms of the 50s and the 60s and 70s, and our care and our attention and our worry about our children. And there was a big question, I'm not sure if I should ask it, that's been, everyone on our email group has
I
been
have an idea of what it is, but go ahead.
Do you really? Tell me what you think of it.
No.
Okay. So
Questions.
one of the moms in the group is a doctor, and she just said flat out at the end that Lydia had a psychotic break, and then the big discussion ensued. Did she intentionally kill herself, or was she just being? Another part of the discussion was she being a teenager? Teenagers think they can do everything, and she was just feeling great about herself, but forgot she didn't know how to swim.
All right, so I'm curious now because I have gotten to do this a lot. So the question has to do with Lydia, and like a member of the book group in question thought that she had a psychotic breakdown. Other people thought she was just being a teenager. How many of you were going to ask a similar question about this just out of curiosity? A number of you. So I've been asked this question a lot, and I think a lot of it has to do with book clubs, which I love, and I love hearing that a book club has had a spirited, let's say, discussion about the book. Because for me, I think that's one of the best things that a book can do. You can like it or not like it. No book is for everybody, but if it gets you talking to other people, which I think is sort of the point of the Community Reads program, I think then fiction is sort of doing its job. What I've found is that people who ask me, they say, well, was Lydia's done suicide? Was she having a breakdown? Did she not mean to? Was it an accident? What happened? what I found is that the people who ask me this actually have a pretty strong idea themselves. And what they really would like is for me to tell them that they're right and that the other people in their book club got the other things wrong. But so here's the thing, that I actually don't answer this question because I think that the author is actually the worst possible person to ask to explicate his or her own work. We have no perspective on our own work. And more to the point, I would never want to be the author who is leaning over the reader's shoulder and saying, you got that right, oh, you got that wrong, you got that wrong. Because the relationship is really between you and the book. And so I, as the author, need to step back. Neil Gaiman, who's a pretty popular author, has a policy that he refers to as pretend I'm dead, meaning that he backs out and allows each reader to form their own relationship with the book. So I don't think I can better Neil Gaiman. But I want to speak to the first comment that you had, which is you had said that the discussion in the book group revolved a lot around feeling empathy for women in the 50s and the 60s and mothers of that time. And I think that we have this idea that that was then and this is now, and we've totally solved all of the issues that we're having. And yet we're still having these debates right now. I mean, you take a look at the newspaper headlines. We're talking about why do women earn 70 cents on the dollar, right? There was an article in the Atlantic, I think maybe now a couple years ago, by Anne-Marie Slaughter called Why Women Still Can't Have It All. And now she's written a book about it because we're trying to figure out still, how do you balance the things that you want to do and having a family life, not just for women, but for men too. And so I think you're absolutely right that these are issues that are really still with us. Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
So it sounds like from the closing part of your talk that you started to embrace your role in the public eye as more of an activist kind of role. You mentioned you want to be seen, you want to be visible. What can we, as communities of just average folks in a town in America, just readers of books and whatnot, do to change these negative attitudes and social constructions like racism and sexism that are pervasive across a much larger social group than people in an auditorium?
Okay, that's a great question. I'll repeat it in case any of you couldn't hear. The question is sort of in the end section of my talk. I sort of take a little bit more of an activist stance. I think you're right that I think it's important to talk about these issues, and because for better or worse, I now have an audience. I, not just you, but generally speaking, this is something that I feel that I should talk about. And the question is sort of, what can we, as an average community in an average town, do to sort of talk about these issues and kind of combat issues of racism or sexism and all these things? I'll first say that I actually don't think that Brookline is a very average community. I think, I mean it, I'm not pandering to the audience, but I think that Brookline is very well educated. You have a lot of resources, and you have a lot of people who think carefully about these issues. And so in that sense, I think that the fact that you have a community reads program where you read books that talk about different issues and then try and talk to each other about them, I feel like is sort of the step one of solving those, these issues. I think that it's always going to be a process. If there were a magical solution, that would be amazing. But I think that talking about these things and reading books that sort of take you outside your comfort zone, or that touch on topics or cultures or people that you aren't familiar with, is a really important step in just sort of being aware of what's going on. The publishing industry actually has been talking a lot about issues of diversity, the fact that there are very, very few publishers or publicists or pretty much anybody of color, and what that means about who gets to get read. And so it's something that I think the more people talk about it, the more you become aware of it, we start to see ways that we can sort of influence it. It's a big problem. I don't have an answer to this, but it's a great question. Other questions? Yes.
I guess my question is, I found myself in a very frustrated stand. I mean, I get that there were all these issues
just want to make sure everybody can hear it. It has to do with sort of, feeling frustrated with the family and the sort of, I guess, ruts that they have worked themselves into, and in particular, the mother, who does a lot of things that I think we would say are bad decisions, and maybe decisions that we wouldn't make ourselves, and in particular, I'm going to spoil it for people who have not read the book, but she leaves her family for a period of time. And although she does come back, this is one of the sort of roots of the tragedy. A lot of people have expressed sort of a similar frustration to what you said, where they said, I cannot imagine leaving my family. And I, as a mother of a small child, I have a hard time when I have to leave and go on book tour. And we all know I'm coming back, and it's very difficult to be away from a child. And so I think you're right. It can be difficult, I think, to imagine your way into a character who makes a decision very, very different from yours. But what I wanted to look at was what might happen again if there was a woman who really felt that she didn't have other good choices. And if she decided to make a decision that we might not make in our real lives, what might be the effects of that? And so in a way, the book was sort of my exploring the sort of things that would terrify me the most, which is being separated from my child. I think realistically speaking, we all maybe have moments as parents where we just kind of go, you are driving me nuts. And if I could just, for a second, if I could have my own life back, how great that would be. And then we start going, okay, but I don't actually want that. But in fiction, I think one of the things that writers do is we do explore the things that sort of terrify us most or that mystify us most. And so I wanted to try with this character of the mother in particular to try and explore, well, what would that be like? Why might a woman do that and what might happen afterwards? For me, that's a way of trying to empathize and trying to understand why someone would make a decision very, very, very different from one that I would make. So what kind of question would you give? Yes?
Did you happen to see the New York Times article on Betty Crocker recipes from the 50s?
Did I happen to see the article on the Betty Crocker recipes from the 50s? Somebody just sent it to me on Twitter today, but I was really busy practicing for this, so I haven't read it, but I have it bookmarked and I'm going to read it tonight. I only saw that the first part includes a fantastically gross description of an aspic that has asparagus in it and some kind of salmon mousse, and so I'm really delighted to read it. So I'm looking forward to it. Yes, there, and then I'll come over there and then again. Yes?
I'm curious about the Asian American reaction to your book. I'm mixed race and I grew up in an all-white town. And I was just wondering how much you're trying to portray the reaction to racism as deterministic, because there's despair.
As what?
Deterministic
Oh,
in
okay.
some way, because there's despair and pain. And then there's also writing a book and changing the world.
Yeah,
There's different outcomes.
so the question is sort of what the Asian or Asian American response has been to the book. So I never, in writing the book, wanted to say this is what the Asian American experience is like, because people have so many different experiences. I grew up in first I was born in a suburb of Pittsburgh, where in my elementary school there was one black girl, there was one Jewish girl, and there was one Asian girl, who was me, and everybody else was white and Christian. And then I moved to an area in Cleveland, which was considered to be racially diverse in terms of black and white, but there were very few Asian kids in it. I think there were 5 or 6 of us. And so at the same time, I recognize that my experience is very different from people who grew up elsewhere. My cousins who grew up in the Bay Area, for example, were in classes that were majority Asian and majority Cantonese speaking, and their lives were very different from mine. So I never wanted to try and speak for everybody. I don't think that's possible. But I did want to, again, sort of look at what are ways that people can feel other, be made to feel other, and ways, if you have never been in a situation where you're the only person of your race or who looks like you, what might that feel like? My husband is a tall white guy, and we went to Hong Kong to visit relatives, and he said, after we went on the subway, which is an experience in Hong Kong, he said, I always thought I knew what it was like to, stand out. But now I really understand what that was like, because he was about a foot taller than everybody else, and no one else looked like him at all. And everyone was staring at him. So the Asian American response to my book mostly has been really positive. A lot of people have written to say, you know, I'm so happy to see characters who are sort of like me or who reflect some of my experience in the book, which I take as really a huge, huge compliment. Again, I've heard that a lot of books don't have Asian protagonists, and I can think of some, but it's true in looking at sort of the bookshelf that there's not very many Asians in books, especially East Asians, and so mostly they've been very, very happy that my book is out there.
And the second part of the question is, if you experience racism, what do you do about it? And do you think it's always a reaction to the pain?
Yeah, so the question is, when you experience racism, what do you do about it? Do you mean me personally, or what should we generally do?
I was wondering if you felt there was a general response.
It depends. I don't know. It's hard because I think if you have been different in any way because of religion or because of a handicap or anything, it's hard to know whether you should try and educate the person who's talking to you, because often it's not meant maliciously. It's meant, it comes out of a place of just not knowing. Then sometimes you get awfully tired of having to be the explainer for your race or your religion or your handicap or whatever it is. I don't know that there's a universal answer. I think it's a sort of case by case, person by person basis. But these are big questions. So you guys ask good questions. All right, yes, in the back, and then there was someone over here. Yes.
I really enjoyed your book. It's the first one I've voluntarily read since the 7th grade.
Oh, thank you.
But I feel that your examples of discrimination are misplaced because it seems that most discrimination is economically based, and it happens a lot more in the rich cities than out in the small towns of Ohio. I've been in '69. I went out to a small town in Ohio with the mother of my Yankee son, and then I went back to Ohio again in the mid-'70s to work at the toilet parks capital of the world in Mansfield, Ohio, and that was a small town, probably smaller than Brookline, and I also went back there in the 80s to start a bigger company with my Chinese son. I actually just came back from Ohio last month for my student reunion year. And so I didn't really face or feeling discrimination compared to being born in Boston, where I couldn't get into a building trade union, where I had a door slammed in my face in Brookline, or when I was told that, we wouldn't sell this house to an alien, before I had a chance to explain I was born in Boston. And the examples are like, but it seems like there has to be an economic basis for discrimination. And out in the Rust Belt, there isn't much business.
So the comment, I don't know if you guys can all hear from the back corner. So the comment is that, thank you for sharing your experience. It's sort of finding that sometimes there is more discrimination in a big city, and that maybe it's almost economically based rather than in a small town. First, I'm really happy to hear that you didn't feel, feelings of sort of being othered or being discriminated against, because hopefully that is what we want to move towards. I think that the sad truth about racism is that there's plenty of it to go around, and that it's in big cities, it's in small towns, it's all over the place, and it comes in different forms. I certainly don't think that it's only a small town thing. I've definitely been in downtown Cleveland and gotten yelled at by a drunken man to go back where I came from, who spit at me. So these sorts of things, I think, unfortunately, can happen anywhere and can also not happen anywhere. And so that's part of the issue, is that, this is a much more pervasive problem than, it's not just, small town people don't know about race. It happens in a lot of places. So thank you for sharing that experience. We'll take one more question. Okay, yes. Yes, you, sorry, in the black shirt.
So what's next?
What's next? That is a good question. Thank you, and thank you for asking that. I am working on another novel. Progress has been a little bit slow. I was in New York for a friend's wedding this weekend, and I met with my agent who was in New York, and we had a lovely breakfast, and then she said very tactfully, "So, how are you feeling about a schedule for giving me some kind of draft for some other project?" Which I thought was a very gentle way of nudging. I'm hoping to write another novel that I think is going to be set in my hometown of Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is was a lovely place to grow up, and I have a lot of fond memories of it. It's very progressive, it's very green, it's fairly racially diverse, it's very affluent, but there are also a lot of weird quirks that it has. So I think because they are very progressive and they're very racially diverse, they're very conscious of appearance. And so the example that I give is that on garbage day, you are not allowed to bring your garbage to the curb because the street will look messy. So you have to keep your garbage at the back where nobody can see it. And the city has a fleet of tiny, tiny little garbage trucks that drive down your driveway, every single driveway, and pick up the garbage in the back and take it to the big garbage truck so that there's never any garbage. The street never looks messy. And there are a lot of things like that, but it feels like a very metaphorically rich sort of thing that you have to keep all of your garbage and your ugly stuff hidden. So I'm still figuring out the book, but I think it's going to involve a family living in this town and some people from outside who come in and probably cause some trouble. So thank you for that. Thank you all so much for your questions. Thank you for
I'd really like to thank Celeste for her wonderful book and her wonderful presentation tonight. And I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of the library for participating in Brookline Reads 2015. Celeste will be signing books that Dana will be selling on the way out. And if all of you could fill out one of the comment cards about what you thought of the event and where you heard about it, there is a jar next to Dana to drop those in. So thank you very much.